Hello, welcome to week 3 of our course. I look forward to working with you. The principal theme of this week will be the American Revolution, and we will also be exploring Shays' Rebellion. During this week, you will be asked to read 3 chapters from Boundless, your text, chapters 6, 7, and 8, which will address the American Revolution and its aftermath. You will be asked to watch a short video by a historian named Gordon Wood. It's 2 minutes and 45 seconds in length, in which he offers his take on the American Revolution. And you will be asked to complete 2 written assignments. One written assignment is a discussion board, where you'll be asked to comment upon the American Revolution and differing interpretations of the American Revolution. And a second assignment is a blog post, in which you will be asked to comment upon Shays' Rebellion and what Shays' Rebellion reveals about the American Revolution. So I would like to offer some comments related to both the American Revolution and Shays' Rebellion. The American Revolution took place from 1776 to 1783. It began formally on July 4th, 1776, when the American patriots declared independence from Great Britain, and it ended in 1783 after a lengthy war when Great Britain formally agreed to recognize the independence of the United States in a peace treaty. So what was the American Revolution all about? Why did it take place? What was the nature of the dispute? I would argue that the American Revolution was a dispute over both political and economic power. So, political power. There is a fundamental dispute over whom had the right to govern the American colonies. And this dispute had been taking place for a period of many years. On the one hand, the businessmen and landowners in colonial America believed that they had a right to govern themselves. And they traced this back all the way into early colonial American history. For many, many decades, actually for well over a century, there had been colonial assemblies in America. As far back as 1619, colonists in Virginia had established a House of Burgesses in colonial Virginia. This was an elected assembly. Not everyone could participate, but all men who owned land could participate in electing members to the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And the House of Burgesses in Virginia, starting in 1619, claimed the right to enact laws for colonial Virginia. All of the colonies in British North America would establish similar elected bodies that claimed the right to enact laws. And most had similar laws regarding voting rights. Men who owned land or who owned property could vote. So you have here a claim of authority. The colonists themselves are claiming that they have a right to self-government. And they were tracing this back to English history as well. There's a tradition from English history dating all the way back to the Magna Carta, where English landowners claimed that they had a right to representation, that the king did not have absolute power, but the English landowners also had some right of self-government. And the colonists were essentially claiming that for themselves, that they too, as quote-unquote Englishmen, had a right to participate in self-government, essentially. Now, we would not view this as a full democracy. Obviously, women were disenfranchised. The vast bulk of the African American population was disenfranchised. But there was a notion of representative government, at least on the basis of landowning white men, believed that they had a right to self-government in colonial America. The British government fundamentally did not agree with this. The British government asserted that the colonists had no fundamental right to govern themselves. From the perspective of the British government, which consisted of both the monarchy, the king, and the British Parliament, the colonists had no right to self-government. So the British system of government, you had the monarchy, which at this point was the king, King George III, and you had the Parliament. The Parliament was an elected body. It was elected by land-owning men in England, England, Scotland, and Wales. But the British Parliament asserted that it had power to govern the entire British Empire, and that included all of the British Empire's colonial possessions, including the American colonies. And the colonies, according to the British Parliament, had no right to govern themselves. Laws passed by the British Parliament had authority over all colonial territories. The British government asserted that all colonists were, quote, virtually represented within the British Parliament. While the American colonists did not elect representatives to the British Parliament, the idea was that members of the British Parliament looked out for the interests of all British subjects, wherever they were. So this was a fundamental dispute. Did British Parliament have power over the American colonists, or did the colonists' own elected colonial assemblies have power? And it came into a dispute over who had a right to govern the colonies, came down to a dispute over who had a right to govern the colonies. There's a second layer of dispute here, and this was an economic dispute. There was economic tension between Great Britain and its colonies in North America. The colonies in North America were viewed as a source of profit by Britain, at least potentially as a source of profit by Great Britain. So the British passed a series of laws called the Navigation Acts, which restricted the trading privileges of the American colonists. American colonists were only allowed to trade with the British Empire. So by law, merchants in Boston could not conduct trade with the Dutch. They could not conduct trade with the French. They could only conduct trade with the British Empire. Now, of course, this was very restrictive on the merchants in Boston and the merchants in New York. They wanted to trade with the Dutch and the French. Sometimes they could make a better profit by trading with the Dutch or the French, but the laws said that they could not. So this was a source of tension and strife. Another source of tension was taxation. The British Empire wanted to collect taxes from its American colonists, especially from merchant trade. The British Empire did have to spend a lot of money to maintain its empire in colonial North America. And this was particularly true during periods of warfare. The British had competition in North America. The greatest example of this was the French. Not so long before the American Revolution, in the period from 1754 to 1763, the British and the American colonists had fought a war against the French and French colonists in North America. This was known as the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian Wars. American colonists typically called it the French and Indian Wars. The British had had to send over thousands of British troops to colonial North America to fight this conflict. It was very costly, very expensive, and the British Empire, the British government, asserted that American colonists should have to pay the expense, or at least part of the expense of this war. So, following the French and Indian War, the British government tried to increase taxes on the American colonists to recoup the costs and expenses of the war. And of course, American colonists were very upset with this. Another source of tension was a dispute over Western migration. The British Empire tried to restrict American migration to the West. They created a proclamation line of 1763 and stated that no American settlers would move west of this line. What the British were trying to do was to avoid conflict with Native Americans. But of course, the American colonists did not want to respect this line of western migration. So that was a source of tension between the American settlers and the British. All of this converged into a conflict that ultimately erupted into the American Revolution. The spark of the Revolution was in Boston primarily. In Boston, there were protests against taxes. This ultimately led to the Boston Tea Party and the destruction of tea from the British East India Company. This in turn led the British government to dissolve the Massachusetts Legislative Assembly, and finally this led to armed and open conflict between the colonists and the British Empire. Now, there are differing interpretations of the impact and meaning of the American Revolution. Gordon Wood is one very prominent historian of the American Revolution. He argues that the American Revolution was one of the most important events in American history, and he argues that the American Revolution was important because of the ideals that motivated it. Gordon Wood argues that the American Revolution gave rise to ideals of liberty and equality that have helped to guide the United States ever since. That essentially the ideals that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence come from the American Revolution, and that the early United States, the country that came out of the American Revolution, was the most democratic country in the world at the time. That if you compare the United States, say, in 1800 or 1820 to any other country in the world at that time, that the United States was far more democratic. Now, he does acknowledge, and you'll see in the video, that by modern standards, the United States was not very democratic, that women didn't have the right to vote, that slavery was an institution that was widespread in America. But he notes that in comparison to other states at the time, America was a very egalitarian society by comparison. And he argues that that can be traced back to the ideals of the Revolution. So he argues that the Revolution was a transformative moment in American and world history, that it truly was a revolutionary moment, and that it brought about dramatic change. Not everyone agrees with this interpretation of the American Revolution. One scholar who traditionally has disagreed with this interpretation is Bernard Bailyn. Bernard Bailyn is also a very prominent scholar of the American Revolution, and Bernard Bailyn has also written texts related to the American Revolution, and he argues that the American Revolution really wasn't a revolution at all, in the normative sense of that word. Bailyn argues that if you look at the people who held power in colonial America before the Revolution, and the people that held power in the early United States immediately after the Revolution, they're essentially the same group of people. So Bailyn argues when you speak of a revolution, you're speaking of some dramatic change in government, dramatic change in who holds social, political, and economic power. And Bailyn says you don't really see that in the American quote-unquote revolution. Bailyn suggests that there's really no major transfer of power, that the American aristocracy of the the period before the Revolution and the American aristocracy after the Revolution is essentially unchanged. George Washington was the largest landholder in colonial Virginia in the years before the Revolution, and he was the largest landholder in the state of Virginia after the Revolution. That was true of many of the other prominent figures in America at the time. That the aristocracy, the wealthy, the leading figures in America essentially remained unchanged. That, yes, the British were removed from power, but the leading figures in American life essentially remained unchanged. There was no great overturning of power in America. Compare the American Revolution of 1776 to 1783 to, say, the Russian Revolution of 1917-1918, the Communist Revolution. In the Communist Revolution of 1917-1918, the wealthy men of power in Russia in 1917 were largely killed or exiled from their country. They were executed in mass, removed from power, or driven into exile. And you had a totally new group of people taking power. There was a fundamental overturning of the social order. Well, Bailyn says nothing like that happens in America between 1776 and 1783. The same wealthy landowners who dominated America before the Revolution continue to dominate America after the Revolution. Slavery is not abolished as a result of the Revolution. The oppressed don't gain power as a result of the Revolution in America. So he argues that it really wasn't a revolution in the normative sense of that word. So you do have a fundamental disagreement between, say, Gordon Wood and Bernard Bailyn about what the revolution is. I'm not going to try to answer which one of those two individuals is correct. I think it's more complicated than saying that one man is right and one is wrong, or one interpretation is right and one is wrong. And actually, your discussion board question asks you to consider this question. So, I think it would be not helpful if I were to jump in and say this is my view on the issue at this point either. Now, another aspect of American history that you're asked to comment upon is Shays' Rebellion. For those of you who live in central or western Massachusetts, this is actually part of local history for you as well. Shays' Rebellion refers to a rebellion that took place in 1786 and 1787. So this is a rebellion that takes place just a few years after the American Revolution takes place. It's a rebellion that's named after a man named Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays had served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and after the Revolutionary War he returned to his home in western Massachusetts and became a farmer again. Not an uncommon story, certainly. Most of the men who had served in the Continental Army were farmers, not all, but certainly a majority. And most, after the war, returned to their farms. Now, Daniel Shays' story is quite common in another sense as well. Daniel Shays wasn't really paid anything when he served in the Continental Army. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental government faced a number of financial problems. They didn't really have a lot of money. And so the Continental Congress often paid the soldiers in essentially IOUs. We owe you money. We promise to pay you at some point after the revolution, essentially. So you had thousands of Continental soldiers who were owed money after the Revolutionary War but hadn't been paid. And of course, during the Revolution, they weren't able to work on their farms, weren't able to provide the labor that they normally did for their families. So following the Revolution in 1780, well, he actually was wounded in 17. Daniel Shays was wounded in 1780, so he actually returned home before the end of the Revolution. So the Revolution ends. Daniel Shays is back home working as a farmer along with many other men who had served in the Revolution. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony itself is also facing financial difficulties. The Massachusetts Bay Colony faced a lot of debt from the Revolutionary War. Massachusetts had spent a great deal of money to support the Revolution, had gone into debt to do so, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony was struggling to pay back its debt. Now, when a government owes money, it generally raises money by raising taxes. And that's what the Massachusetts Bay Colony does. Now, the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, well, now it's the state of Massachusetts, I should say. After the Revolution, it becomes the state of Massachusetts. the state of Massachusetts decides to raise taxes. Now, who dominated the government of the state of Massachusetts? It was mostly wealthy interests in and around Boston who really were the dominant forces in the government of Massachusetts. So the wealthy merchant class of Boston really controlled the operation of the government of Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts. Now, Western farmers, farmers in central and western Massachusetts, they felt very distant from the government, the state government, and they felt that they had very little influence over the state government, that the state government was dominated by people in the East that they had a very difficult time relating to. And they felt it was unfair that the state government was raising taxes on landowners, um, and they didn't feel that the state government was really representing their best interests. It should be pointed out the economy in central and western Massachusetts at this point was still really a barter economy. You weren't dealing much with a cash economy. People were trading goods and services with each other. People didn't have a lot of cash in central and western Mass. So they really struggled to raise tax money to pay taxes on their property. And as a result, a lot of the farmers in central and western Massachusetts defaulted on their taxes. They weren't able to pay the taxes on their land, and so local governments were seizing their land. They were foreclosing on their farms. Now, this seemed unfair to a lot of the farmers in central and western Mass, men like Daniel Shays. A lot of them were still owed money by the federal government. The federal government had never paid them the money that they were owed from their service as soldiers in the Revolutionary War. So this is 1786. The war ended 3 years earlier. They still haven't been paid. It's been 3 years. They've never been paid from their service in the Revolutionary War. And now the state government is saying we have to pay off our war debts, so we're raising the taxes on your land, and you have to pay us tax on your land. So they feel they haven't been paid for serving in the war, but now they're having to pay higher taxes as a result of the costs of the war. So it strikes them as inherently unjust. I think perhaps not unreasonably, it strikes them as unjust. So Daniel Shays and a group of other farmers in central and western Massachusetts begin to organize themselves essentially into a militia. They have firearms, as most men in America did at this point. They have some military training. Many of them had fought in the Revolution, and they start to organize themselves to conduct military training. And they basically say the government of Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts, is a tyranny, just like King George III was a tyranny. And as we fought against King George III, we have every right to fight against the government of Massachusetts. And we're going to take up arms and rebel. And that's their intent. They take up arms and they seize control of the court buildings in central and western Massachusetts. And basically they say, no one can seize our land if the courts don't function. In order to seize their land, the court has to issue an order to foreclose on their land. So if they seize the court buildings, no order of foreclosure can be issued. So they literally take control of the court buildings under force of arms. So this creates a crisis, a national crisis. The state of Massachusetts has to decide how to deal with this. The government of the United States has to decide how to deal with this. There is no standing federal army at this point. There's no U.S. military to step in. Businessmen in Boston start raising private funds to hire their own private militia to march into western Massachusetts to restore, state power. There's a recognition that the federal government really doesn't have the capacity to put down this rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion actually gives momentum to the movement to create a constitution, to increase the power of the central government, to prevent this type of rebellion from happening in the future, to create a standing army and a stronger central government to prevent these sorts of insurrections from happening in the future. So in some ways, Shays' Rebellion gave momentum to the creation of the Constitution of the United States that we see today. So I hope that this will be helpful. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to working with you this week.